All right, 11 o'clock. We're ready to go. So today's session, first of all, again, thank you for participating in the conference today. It's a pretty awesome day today. Loved the keynote and the secretary's kickoff speech. Although Mike Ware kind of forced my hand now that I have to now that I'm the SharePoint whisperer, I may have to change my working title. We're going to talk about permissions in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Microsoft Teams. But before we do, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Um, Make sure that you have your camera turned off. Mic should be muted. Again, we're going to try to take the questions in the chat because of the number of people that are in this session. Um, Sharing screen, that's me. Chat messages, you can see where that's at. Raise your hand, clap your hand, whatever is there. And let's move on. All right, about a little about me. I don't like to talk about myself, but people like to hear, who you are and why you think you should be doing this presentation. First of all, I'm no expert. Matter of fact, if anybody says they're an expert with SharePoint and 365, take it with a grain of salt, because even with my doing this for you know 26, 27 years now, um, it's there's no such thing as experts, because then Microsoft will come along and change something. And usually right in the middle of a presentation like this, you'll go to click a link and it's not the same. So I kind of liken it to, in a way, maybe not the same degree, but pretty close to being a doctor, where you have to constantly retrain yourself over and over, because again, things change. You wouldn't believe how many versions of SharePoint there's been since back in the late 90s, when Microsoft purchased Vermeer Technologies Incorporated. I think Microsoft states that, they started SharePoint in like 2000, 2001, somewhere around there. But actually, there was a company called Vermeer Technologies that had a little tool that some of you might remember called Front Page. And Front Page had a little personal server on there, and they had a little something called Team Pages. Microsoft bought that in the late 90s, and a couple of years later, they came out with the very first version of SharePoint. Matter of fact, even today, if you were to get on the back end of the server and look at the files, you would see an underscore VTI as some of the files, and that actually stands for Vermeer Technologies Incorporated. So it's been a fun ride between now and then. Thankfully, in 2010, I was involved with the beta of Office 365, and really haven't looked back. I left the on-prem versions of SharePoint behind, and even though I dabble with them from time to time, I would much rather stay in the cloud these days. I'm currently working as Senior Enterprise 365 Admin for Enterprise Collaboration Services. And if you joined the keynote this morning with Mike Ware, he and I worked together to create the first intranet with DIT, and then move on to create and help create the other intranets on the tenant. And that was 8 years ago. Now, about this session. We're going to talk about permissions in 365, and it can be very simple or very complex. And usually it's pretty complex. I remember the very first white paper that I saw way back when, from Microsoft on permissions, and from what I remember, it was at least 100 pages long, if not more. And obviously, I didn't read every single page. But over the past 27 years, I feel like I've experienced every single problem that was mentioned in that document, including poor planning and lack of understanding about permissions. So let's just say that permissions are one of the top issues that you will have that causes you as an end user or you as a site owner or even an admin like myself the most problems of anything. And that goes for permissions in SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and it's one of the hardest to fix, even by us admins. However, with a little bit of planning of your permissions, you can avoid those issues by keeping your permission structures simple and clean. And I'm going to put an emphasis on that simple. All right, a few overall practices in 365, no matter what you're dealing with, whether it be OneDrive, SharePoint, or even Microsoft Teams. First, be aware of what permissions your content needs and what that content is. Excuse me. Don't be responsible for a data breach. So what I mean is, an internet should be consumption related, meaning that the home page or what they call the hub of your internet, it's generally for news and maybe some links to blank forms and a document library. Don't put sensitive information in those sites. And that's why permissions are really important. It's so easy to just accidentally, excuse me, right through. It's so easy to accidentally put the wrong stuff in there. And that second bullet point that talks about good document management, that ties into what I'm talking about. Because if you're just taking a folder from your hard drive or network share, dragging and dropping it into SharePoint or Teams, or even OneDrive for that matter, and doing it without seeing what's in there and whether people should see things in there, that could be a huge issue. We have had instances in the past where somebody actually did that, and in the bottom of a pile of about 1,000 documents was a document with information that people shouldn't have seen. So it's I can't stress enough how important planning permissions are, knowing what that content is. Plan out your permissions and content structure in advance so it makes sense and it's simple. Again, simple. Less is more. You've heard that before. And it's really true with permissions. The more complicated you make it, the harder it is to manage. And if you don't plan out your permissions, you can have some really, really difficult issues. For example, and I see people do this all the time, don't try to create hundreds of thousands of unique granular permissions in one document library, for example, or granular permissions for that matter at all. And that means you have a different permission on every file or every folder. And, one way that causes problems, I'll give you an example. I was working with a group several years ago that had a single document library with approximately 10 different folders, and in each folder were, just for the sake of the example, maybe 10 documents per folder. So you had about 100 documents in 10 folders. And over time, people would change the permissions by hitting the share button all the time. Even though they all had access to the site, they'd hit the share button, which changes permissions, which a lot of people don't know. And in a year's time, every single folder in that library and every single file had unique permissions. Excuse me again. And after that year, they hired a new person and they gave them access to their site and to their document library. And that person could see a single folder and a single file. And that's because, now that next bullet point says, don't make it a habit of breaking inheritance. It's because all those unique permissions break inheritance from what you have in the site. So if you add somebody to the site and you have broken inheritance in there where you've got unique permissions on a folder and on a file, then those permissions don't flow down and they won't see files they don't have permissions on. Now, how do you fix something like that? Well, the longer it goes, the harder it is to fix.
Well, I've been
Excuse
thinking
me,
about you for the last 15 minutes.
Excuse me.
I mean, longer than that, but for thinking about dinner and you in the last 15 minutes.
Hey, Michelle, can you? Thank you very much. All right. Where was I? Do not make a habit of breaking inheritance. Now, the only way to fix that is to take and do what I call flush the permissions, which means rehook up all those permissions to the parent. And then you're able to reconnect those permissions and bring somebody in. Now that's on 100 files. And again, if you have 100 different unique permissions, guess what? You have to manage 100 different permissions. Now we had one agency that came to me, and they had an entire site, not just a document library, not just 100 documents. They had an entire site that after a couple of years, the permissions was so broken that it was very difficult to figure out what was wrong when somebody couldn't have access to a document. In the end, with that many documents and that much content, they had to actually rebuild the site and then piece by piece move documents into a little more structured setup, like a document library for files that needed to be have unique permissions and documents that were fine to have permissions with people that were allowed into the site. But they had to redo the whole thing, and that took some time. So again, really important. Be aware of what content you have, what your audience is, and what's in there, and try not to break inheritance. I know it's hard to do because we're used to in years past, and on network shares, just every file has a different set of permissions. Do your best not to do that, because in the end, you're going to end up shooting yourself in the foot. Practice least privilege. Don't grant a higher permission level than your users must have to work with content. And that's a really important thing, in that you don't want everybody in your site or your team to have full access to your files. Before you know it, you'll have files that are deleted accidentally and changed. Don't do that. Matter of fact, when you take over a site as a site owner, one of the first things you should do is look at those permissions and see, okay, does this person need to be an owner? Does this person need to have edit rights? And if not, then it's perfectly fine to give people visitor rights, which is read only, and not have that problem. But I've been on some sites where everybody's an owner, everybody's a member, and that can cause you problems. And finally, don't allow users to invite others to your sites and your content. By default, this is usually left to the owners only. Matter of fact, if you try to share a document outside your team or who has access to your SharePoint site, then typically what's going to happen is the owner of that team or site is going to get a notification that says, hey, so-and-so wants to share this document with someone else. Again, remember, if you say yes, that means that document will have unique permissions and will not inherit permissions from the parents. Be careful how you do that. But another thing that people don't think about in Teams and in SharePoint sites that have external access, if you allow your users to invite others to your sites, they're going to be able to invite anybody, and that anybody means they can invite an external user, somebody from the newspaper or WRAL or something like that. They can invite anybody there. And unlike us that are in the state and we're in there and tied to our NCID, and external users there, um, uh, as long as the owner allows them to be. So if you invite external users in and you are a site or a team owner, again, not only do you need to know what content is there and what permissions are on that content, but you need to know the people that have access. Finally, this is one of the reasons why us as admins, just because we're an admin, we shouldn't is a better word, but we should not be granting access to your team or your SharePoint site or your OneDrive. And the main reason that is that it's your site, it's your content. You need to know who's in there and what permissions are there. And if anybody could come up to an admin or put in a ticket and say, I want access to the site, and we just do it because we can, at some point, somebody's going to get into your site that you don't want them in. So always, always, us admins will say, team owners, site owners, they're responsible for doing permissions. And if you have trouble with permissions, I mean, a lot of what I said already, even though I'm trying to keep it at a little bit higher level, I mean, it sounds complex, and it really is. All right. Theme in the message today: do not overcomplicate. And for anybody that's seen Jurassic Park, this is a picture of Malcolm, and he's saying, you were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. And we all know what happens in Jurassic Park. Most all the visitors get eaten. And similar with permissions, just because you need permissions, doesn't mean you should. Just because you can you can put millions of files in a document library and then have multiple permissions in there, doesn't mean you should. You want to keep it simple. You want to keep it organized. And that will save you problems in the future. Or, better said, the further you go down into the weeds, the more difficult it is to support. And the hardest thing about that is that you won't know you're in trouble until you're in trouble. All right. Let's talk specifically about OneDrive for Business. And there's a lot of people that worry about OneDrive for Business, but OneDrive is probably the most secure location for content that we have. Matter of fact, due to we're a state government and we have a state tenant, and one of the rules we have on our tenant is that OneDrive for Business files cannot be shared outside the state. We need to make sure you've got your mic muted if possible.
What?
Thank you. So OneDrive is your own personal location for content you're working on. You fully own all the content, and when you get a OneDrive, nobody else can see it, access it, or find it in a search unless you personally grant permission or share it with others. That includes us admins. We have to do a little magic in the back end to even see what's in this OneDrive. And by default, we don't have access. The only way we have access is if there's some kind of ticket that's put in that says, so-and-so left the organization and there was some important stuff we needed to get in there. And even then, the CIO has to grant permission to get into somebody's OneDrive. So it's very private. And again, people worry about that, but they don't stop and think they're in full control of it. And again, by default, only you have access. And we'll look at it here in a second so you can see how you can tell who has access to what in your OneDrive. Now, again, big rule, don't make so many granular or unique permissions that you cannot keep up with it. 100 different permissions on 100 different files means 100 different permissions you have to manage. So it's easier to let slip or have permissions that you don't mean to leave out there if you have to manage hundreds, if not thousands. So just be careful. It's not something, again, it's something we used to do all the time, a long time ago, but keep it simple. Always know who has access to your content. And here's a big thing. You can remove them and should remove them later if you need to, or you find that these people don't need, forever access to your documents. All right, let's take a quick look at OneDrive. All right, for most of us, the best way to work with OneDrive content is in the cloud. And I'm not gonna, and again, this is more of a permission setup, so or a session, and we won't talk so much about the actual product, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams as much as we will the permissions in there. So, but here, usually the best way to work with OneDrive is from the cloud. And that's because they're safer in the cloud. If somebody steals your laptop or gets into your laptop and you have files synced, it's not as easy to protect it as it is if you keep it in the cloud. So let's click over here in what we call the app launcher, and let's go to OneDrive. Now, I like the way Microsoft has started to change up the user interface. So on mine, the first place I go is the OneDrive home, and it just shows all my recent files. Shows files shared with me and shared by me. This is about the only place, OneDrive is about the only place where you're going to hear me say it's okay to hit the share button. Now in Teams and in a SharePoint, do that with caution. Excuse me. Got to do not disturb. All right, I'll cut down on that. So here's my files. And you'll notice you've got the folders. Looks just like a document library, and there's a reason for that. Is because OneDrive for Business, or the difference between OneDrive for Business and OneDrive Personal, is that OneDrive Personal is kind of like which we don't use here with the state, but for the sake of differences, OneDrive Personal is more like a network share or Dropbox. OneDrive for Business is built on top of a hidden SharePoint site, and what you're looking at is actually a document library. And that means that a lot of the rules that you have in SharePoint document libraries applies here in your OneDrive. Now, if I want to look and see quickly what files, what folders are shared in OneDrive, I've got a little sharing area, and I can see very quickly that all this is private. Now, if I get down to here, I find a file. It says it's shared. So let me click on that. And very quickly, I can tell you that our host for today, Karen Mann, has access to my file there. Now, if I want to grant more access to this file, or I haven't granted any access, I can go in here and share. Now, I want to point this out. I have two ways to share. One is to hit the share and provide a link, or I can grant them direct access. Now, even I get confused about this stuff, and I'm thinking, okay, what's the difference between the two? Do they have any different permissions? And honestly, there's absolutely no difference between sharing the link, because when you share a link, you grant them access to the file or folder, or direct access. So let's do a direct access for the heck of it. I am going to let's give Michelle Allen access to that file. Leave a little message. And notify people means that I don't have to send them a link, and I don't have to send them an email. The system is going to do that for me. So grant access and notified. There we go. Now let's go back down and look at that file so you can see what kind of permissions. Look at that. I shared with Michelle Allen just now, and if I go in here and click shared again, now you see this. Now I know that Karen was shared through a link, and Michelle Allen's given direct access to one. They both have the same permission. Now let's pull this down. Now, people you specify can view, and I can change that. But in this case, Karen Mann has the ability to view it. Michelle Allen has the ability to edit it. And oops. Let's go back real quick. Bit of delay there. Come on. It's not going to work for me again, is it? Always during a demo. This drop down should allow. There we go. I can stop sharing, and I can change Michelle's access to view only. See the little eyeball there. All right. Now, that's about as simple as what OneDrive is. And since it is my content and I've got to manage it, I can pretty much do what I want. But again, nobody has access to this except for I invite them. And if I am done with their them being shared with that document, every once in a while I should actually go in there and audit my own stuff and see what I can do. And I'm going to remove Karen Mann. Not personal there, Karen. Oop. And you saw how easy that was. Now just Michelle Allen has access to that file. So that's kind of the top level of OneDrive, which I wish everything was that simple. But let's jump in here and let's take a look in SharePoint. Now, SharePoint's probably SharePoint teams are both equally complex, but let's look at SharePoint first. SharePoint access is primarily accomplished through the use of 3 default SharePoint groups. Those groups are visitors, members, and owners. Now, visitors have read-only access. Members, by default, have edit access. And owners have full control. Now, you can change up these permissions. If you are an owner, you can go in and change the visitors so they can view, but they can't download anything. You can change the members group. So the members don't have edit access, which gives them the ability to delete stuff. I don't like to have my stuff deleted, so I may change that to contribute. And we'll look at how you do that real quick when we move on to look at SharePoint. And the owners have full control. Now, golden rule, you won't read this anywhere unless you're in have a ticket with Microsoft. Never delete or rename any of the default SharePoint groups. Now, I see people all the time that say, I don't like the name of the group. Well, the name of the groups are set when the site's created. And so they'll change the name or they'll delete the groups. What they don't know is particularly the members and the owners, are linked to permissions. So if you delete the owners group or the members group, if you delete the members group, the owners are going to have problems inviting people because there's no default members. And that goes to say, even if you've added your own custom groups, which I would suggest that you don't do a bunch of that. You work with these default groups. And then if the owners group is deleted, naturally, we're going to fix it. We can add another group and we can say, okay, everybody in this group has full control. But you know what? If that new group that was meant to fix the deleted owners group is not reassociated, I'm going to try not to get in the weeds here, not reassociated with the site again, the owners are still going to have a lot of problems. I can't tell you how many times I've had owners call me or send me an email and say, I got full control. Why can't I do this? And then I find out later, you deleted the owners group and then added it back. So full control doesn't always mean full control if you've deleted that. So name of the game here is don't delete or rename the default groups. Now, do not break permission inheritance unless you absolutely have to. And if you absolutely have to, make sure you're organized in such a way that, for example, if you have some content that only certain people should view, consider having another document library. You can have as many document libraries in your site as you want. Consider another document library and just have your unique permissions on that library. That's why it's easier to know, hey, this content has unique permissions. This content in this library inherits permissions from the parent site. Again, in a SharePoint site, nobody can see the content there unless you grant them permissions. Matter of fact, it will not even show up in a search. Because searches are security trimmed in such a way that if you don't have permission, the content in somebody's site or somebody's team or even the OneDrive shared content, if you don't have permission, you're not going to see that pop up. And again, that's something people contact me with and say, oh no, my stuff is open to everybody. And it's because they shared it. Another thing people don't realize, and it's kind of a little bit off the track on this, but if you share your document from OneDrive in your email or SharePoint in your email, 365 is going to consider that it's okay for that person to see it. So if they do a search, that email may come up for that document. And then you're saying, well, I didn't share that. Yes, you did. You sent them a copy of it in your email. So if you continue to break, as mentioned earlier, inheritance and having unique granular permissions, too much of it, it's not something you can do it, but always try not to do it all the time. If you do that, it'll cause problems and administrative nightmares when you overuse that ability. Again, plan your permission strategy. Understand the point of your site. Who's the target audience? What should users be able to do with your content? Who's the site owner? These are all important questions to ask yourself. And if you know the details, the planning process becomes easier. But always remember the point of your site. Now, on the flip side, hubs, intranets. As I mentioned earlier, those top level sites should be considered only for content consumption. You shouldn't have anything on there that you care if anybody sees. Now, the minute you start putting all kinds of limitations on content that doesn't require limitations for access, then you're asking for trouble. So just, keep it simple. And if you don't need to put locks on a file, don't put locks on the file. But if you need to have locks on the file, then by all means put locks on the file. But what people do is they try to lock down everything. It's not only not necessary, but it's it's going to cause you problems in the end when you try to manage hundreds of thousands of documents. So understand the point of the site. And I always like to say, if you're on an intranet that's kind of open, it's okay for people to see a blank form. It's not okay for people to see forms that are filled out. So those two should never be in the same place. SharePoint includes a set of permission levels for a reason. And again, this is managed through SharePoint groups. The levels are well documented, balanced to what users need to do. And, in retrospect, we're going to, we'll call out, we've got read-only rights, you've got edit rights, contribute rights, and full control. If you mostly keep or build off of those basic permissions, then you'll be in pretty good shape. And again, use those SharePoint out of the box permissions, because most of the time, the most you're going to need are visitors, which is read only, members, which is, people can edit things and collaborate on it. And then owners, you have the full control. Custom levels. And again, this is another place we can kind of get out of control. Custom levels are multiple groups. I see people who discover, well, I can create a custom group, and I'll go in and I'll create this group that's for my engineers only. And then I'll create a group for my non-engineers. I'll create a group for leadership. I'll create a group, this group, that group. Before you know it, you can easily have multiple groups. Now, what happens when you have multiple groups? You take one person, they may be in half those groups. And the deeper we go down in a rabbit hole, the harder it is going to be to manage those permissions. So again, plan, think about the permissions, think about the content. Do I need to restrict it? Do I need to have a bunch of custom groups? If the answer is no, don't do it. So don't overcomplicate security when it comes to content access. Very important. Only secure content when there's a real security risk. If something's going to cause a problem, people see it. Like if you have a worksheet that has IP addresses, by all means, keep it in a private area of your SharePoint site, or better yet, keep it in a private Microsoft team that it limits who can come in and see that stuff. Over securing content definitely makes it a nightmare for everybody, especially the site managers and the admins that have to help fix this stuff. All right, simplifying permissions can help avoid frustration. We all need a little less frustration. All right, let's take a jump and look at SharePoint site. And in a SharePoint site, oops, wrong gear, come on. There we go. Site contents. This is where you can set up individual permissions. Right now, this site inherits permissions from the parent. How do I get to the parent? I'm going to go up here to the gear icon again. I'm going to go to site permissions. And of course, I can change how members can share, but I don't want them to share. Because I want to know as an owner who's got access to my stuff. So let's go down to advanced permissions. And here's where we get to the nitty gritty. The important thing about this page is what's in the yellow band. In the yellow band, it's going to tell you there are limited access users on this site. This site has, there's your keyword, site. Now, let's go back for a second to show you the difference. I'm going to go to the document center. I'm going to look at settings. And let's go to permissions. And this is being recorded, so if I move too fast, which I have a habit of doing when I'm limited on time, you can go back and look at it. Now, see the yellow band. What is this telling me? This library. Now, page looks really close to the one I was at the first time. And you wouldn't believe how many times that people go in here and they'll go to sort things out. And this is where they accidentally delete themselves from a site. I've had owners come and get me and say, I can't get into my site. I actually accidentally deleted it. Before you do anything with permissions, look up here in the yellow band and make sure that this is what you want to work with, the library or the site or the folder. So let's jump back over, go to site permissions again, advanced. And here you'll notice that I have the 3 basic groups, and then I have a couple people that are outside the group. And that's because I've given them either special permission or they're an external user. And that's how I can manage it better. If I want, I could create another group, create a group for external users and put them in there. And I can set their permission the way I want it. In this particular point, I have something that's called no C. And it's a shared point group with view only in it. And the reason why I have that is because if I want to set up navigation over here, and again, we're getting down in the rabbit hole, I won't stay there too long, but I can apply a permission to my navigation that people won't be able to see this stuff. But let's look into members. Members on this, because it's an internet, I've changed this from edit to read, because I don't want people going into the top layer of the internet and starting to change or edit files. And I don't want to have unique permissions throughout the whole thing. So I made it members read only. Owners, full control. Visitors, read only. Now, let's look at permission levels. We talked about that. This is probably about as deep as I'm going to go in this session, but full control. They can do anything. That's usually for the owners. Design. Let's say I have somebody that's going to help me with the design of a page. Here they can view, add, update, approve, and customize. There's edit. Edit is usually the default for members. A lot of times I will change that to contribute. It's kind of up to you what you do. Read or view only. Now, I can make my custom one. I wouldn't advise doing that. Everything that you need is right here. But if you absolutely have to, create a permission, for example, that gives members the ability to work with content, but not delete it. That's how you do it. You make a custom permission level. All right. Access request settings. Now, what does that got to do with permissions? I'll show you here. And these things that I'm showing you, only the owners can actually do. Allow members to share the site, individual files, and folders. Allow members to invite others to the site members group, IT members. Those 2 boxes should be unchecked. Access request is fine for that, but these 2 boxes are the most important thing. And unless I told you or you stumbled upon it, you would not know that access request settings has permissions for members. So you want to check that. Site collection admins, they don't show up in any of this. They're actually the site admins, and the most permissions, and I like to talk about least privilege, the highest level permission a site owner needs is in the owners group, which is full control. You don't need to be a site collection administrator unless you're going to do something fancy with it. And I always try to make sure that again, less is more. If I don't have to be a site collection administrator, I'm not going to be that. All right. Again, if you see something that we haven't talked about or I went too fast, you can put the question in the chat, and then we'll try to address it. I know we're going to run out of time here today, but we'll address that even after the meeting for you. And now, in the interest of time, we're going to jump over here and we're going to talk Teams in the last part of this session. Permission in Microsoft Teams. Teams has 2 layers and 2 different types of permissions. It drives myself and my peers throughout the United States and further. a little bit nuts because Teams, you can't just have a team. Teams sits on top of SharePoint. So there's two different types of permissions. The primary team permissions are like AD groups slash 365 groups. And underneath, SharePoint is the container, in quotes. Under Teams has its own permission types, which we just went over, which are SharePoint groups. Now, key things to remember to keep yourself out of trouble when you have a Microsoft team. Always add your users to your team using Microsoft Teams. Don't go into the back end, into the SharePoint site underneath, and add people there. Don't grant access there, because what you're going to end up with is people are going to have access to the content in the SharePoint site underneath and not to Microsoft Teams. So that's the important part. Add your access through Teams. If you have a Microsoft team, and I can't stress this enough, use it. Do not have your users mix and jump between SharePoint and Teams all the time. I have people out there that have a Microsoft team and they work all day in the SharePoint side. You're asking for trouble if you do that. If you have Teams, there's very little that you can't do in Teams. Now, I like to refer to Teams as an automobile. People have heard me say this before. And lift the hood, and underneath is SharePoint. Only the mechanic, the team owner, should go in and work on the SharePoint side, and that's if they want to create something or fix something. But if you're a team member, even an owner, you don't have to go into the SharePoint site all the time. And just like an automobile, you don't drive around with the hood up all the time because you're going to get into an accident. Same thing. You keep jumping between Teams and SharePoint and start working with those different permissions in both, you're going to have problems. Now, DIT teams, or on our tenant, we don't have what's called private channels. There are a lot of reasons for that I can't go into at this point, but once you're a member of a team, remember, if someone grants you access to a team, you have access to everything in the team, but that's by design, because teams are for collaboration. You can't collaborate if you can't work with stuff. There's no such thing as a visitor in Teams. There is in SharePoint, but not in Teams. So remember that. If you have a team, don't try to treat it like a SharePoint site, because the permissions will trip you up every time. Now, while you can create unique granular permissions in the SharePoint site underneath, it's not advised that you do it. If you do, what you really need, if you do that all the time, what you really need is a SharePoint site, not a team. So in the time we have left, I'm going to click on this, going to go to Teams and go to my sandbox. If I'm a site owner, I can add people here, or I could go to Manage Teams. And, excuse me, I can see right here, I'm just the owner here. I don't have any members and guests in here. So let's add a member real quick. And always last name, first name. Add. And Michelle Allen is now a member, and I'm going to close. Now, if I open this up, you're going to see Michelle. That's really simple. I also have some permissions that I can set up on Teams, and another reason I like Teams, it's the things that you can do are very simple. Like I can change the team picture, or I can allow team members to create and update channels. Even though that says create private channels, nothing happens. That's kind of a dummy switch there. Doesn't work. Allow members to delete and so I can set up all kinds of permissions there. Guest permissions, at mentions, which I leave that as is, because unless it's in a huge group, you want people to at mention, bring attention. Team code for granting access to the team. I don't use that. It's because if somebody wants to join my team, they say, hey, can I join your team? I just add them. Well, the team code, you go in there, generate the code, copy the code, add it to an email, say, here, use this code, and you get in. And that takes so much longer than just adding them to the team. And finally, fun stuff. and we won't talk about tax. That's a little bit outside the scope. So we are almost out of time, and I am going to jump back in. And by the way, if you have questions we didn't get to, be sure to ask either in the chat or you can reach out to me by yourself. Okay, Michelle, we got time for maybe a couple of questions. We're going to have to handle a lot of these outside the meeting, but pick me out a couple of questions real quick. Hello?
Yeah, Rod, I've kind of been answering them along the way.
Okay.
But
Okay.
I think some of them were mostly about breaking the inheritance if someone is requesting access to your documents, or if you're sending them access, sharing.
Right. Okay, but you answered a lot of them. Okay. Again, I apologize. Permissions are huge. I mean, I could give several sessions in several different parts, probably do one an all day thing. But the most important thing I want you to take away from this session today is that permissions are a big deal. Whether you if you manage permissions right, then you're doing it in a simple way and you planned out your permissions. If you're doing it wrong, eventually you're going to share something you don't want to have shared. And that to me is enough incentive to make sure that as an owner, remember it's mostly on the owner's shoulders who manage the permissions, I need to be aware of what I have in there. So I appreciate everyone attending. And again, if we didn't get to your question, we'll make sure we reach out to you and try to do our best to answer it. Or you can reach out to either Michelle or myself in private chat and we'll help you out. So thank you everybody for joining.